Thank you very much, Rudy, for keeping us up to date. Now, joining us right now is Aaron Sang. He's the president of Tradivox and general editor of the Catholic Catechism Index, and he contributes to preserving traditional Catholic teachings. With a deep involvement in the English manuscript of Bishop Athanasius Schneider's groundbreaking work, Credo, he asserts its paramount role in contemporary catechisms. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Sang.
Good to be with you, Adrian. Thanks for having me again.
Praise be to God. It's good to have you on. Now, this catechism, very, very interesting. I've been going through it, and I have not been able to get through all of it quite yet, but I plan to. Let's start from the beginning. It is known as a compendium, which I thought was interesting. It wasn't labeled a catechism; it was labeled a compendium. So let's start there. Why is it labeled a compendium, and how is that different, or is it exactly the same as a catechism?
Sure. Well, we could answer that question in any number of ways. The first being a compendium in the bishop's mind is a little more far-reaching than a lot of folks consider the term catechism, whereas many of people think of the Baltimore, for instance, the Baltimore Catechism in this country, where you have kind of a systematic treatment of the truths of faith, which are, of course, treated in Credo. But he reaches a little beyond that. So it does engage a lot more content than catechisms often engage. So things like, practical applications for daily life, regimens of how to combat temptation. You've got a lot of spiritual direction, frankly, in this book that wouldn't appear otherwise in your typical catechism. So that was one of the reasons for choosing that moniker.
Now, before we had you on, I saw on Twitter a young man had tweeted that he's leaving the church because of all the craziness that's going on in the Vatican. And I was making the point that we need to go and we need to be aware of the traditional teachings of the church so that way we are not scandalized with the things happening and we know where we can cling to. So tell me about the purpose of this catechism in regards to you made the comment that it was a paramount role in contemporary catechisms. Tell me about why this is groundbreaking.
Yes, it's tremendous. Could I perhaps read from it, just the bishop's own words?
Please do.
Yeah. So the Bishop Schneider, again, in preparing the text, he kind of explains some of his reasoning, which I find completely compelling. So this is from the author's preface itself. Yes. A Catholic bishop is bound to fulfill his public oath to maintain the deposit of faith entire and incorrupt as handed down by the apostles and professed by the church everywhere and at all times. He's quoting there the interrogation of the bishop-elect from the rite of ordination or consecration of a bishop. So he goes on, therefore, I'm compelled to respond to the requests of many sons and daughters of the church who are perplexed by the widespread doctrinal confusion in the church of our day. I offer this work, Credo Compendium of the Catholic Faith, to strengthen them in their faith and serve as a guide to the changeless teaching of the church. So he goes on. And one of the other reasons I also want to highlight, he mentions further on in the preface here, he says, I also wish to bear public witness to the continuity and integrity of the Catholic and Apostolic doctrine. In preparing this text, my intended audience has been chiefly God's little ones, those faithful Catholics who are hungry for the bread of right doctrine. It's therefore in obedience to my duty toward them, laid upon me in my episcopal consecration to preach the truth in season and out of season, that I publish this compendium at the present time. Thus, Bishop Schneider, our author. So he's very much aware, first of all, of his own task as a bishop. He is, as every bishop is, bound to proclaim the truths of the faith, as you say, even more so in times of widespread doctrinal confusion. You have folks, this poor fellow you mentioned here on Twitter, that are deeply scandalized by the things not only they hear, emanating from the Vatican from time to time, but often even maybe from their own pulpit, maybe from their own local cathedral. And so you have here a bishop who's taking very seriously his duty of fidelity to the magisterium, and then his own solemn public oath, again made by every bishop, to maintain and hand on the deposit of faith. So that's his driving kind of raison d'etre for this whole work. And I point out to you, earlier before we went on the show, that just as a student of the catechetical manuscript tradition, I know of nothing. This is in every way. I think the publisher kind of refers to it as the book of the century. I think that's entirely justified. I can't think of anything like this that has been written, certainly since the council, but really even many years prior, that takes in such a holistic vision of both the truths of the faith themselves. It's a very systematic treatment with incredibly concise and precise articulations of what we believe as Catholics, but also, again, that kind of daily living aspect. Really, it has a copious amount of even kind of spiritual direction that makes its way into these pages. So it's phenomenal. It's a monumental work.
Yeah, I think it's amazing because, I mean, like we've been saying, the times we live in, it's characterized by ambiguity, by confusion, by unclarity. And Bishop Snyder gives a very concise and clear response to a question and answer format. And so many people may ask, why do we need this new catechism if we have the Catechism of the Catholic Church from JP2? And plus, many people say, I use the Baltimore Catechism. I like that a lot. And you have published all these old catechisms. Why a new one?
Yes, great question. The first point is to make that every catechism is set in a historical context of its own. So the reason that we have thousands of catechisms in the Catholic tradition, as again that the Tradovox series illustrates so well, is that the truths of the faith always are articulated in a given time and place. So there's always things, modes of expression. I'm a big student of language, so grammar and syntax is completely governed by your own regional context, so a geographical kind of lay of the land, but also your chronological context. There are terms. English is, of course, a classic example where you have this living language that words today mean things that they did not mean. And we have new words also. So this is something that every living language is always kind of a subject to. And so the articulation of this fixed deposit of faith that we have is always going to bear these kind of new and contemporary expressions, even though the doctrine itself has this marked continuity across time and space. That's something, again, that the Tradovox Project illustrates so well. You have catechisms spanning, the better part of the last millennium, and there is this remarkable, just point for point, you can trace it across continents, you can trace it across centuries, the continuity of this doctrine. But we have run up into something the last 50 years that has never been seen really in the manuscript tradition itself, which is the scope itself is what's unprecedented, where you have formulations that have no pedigree in the Catholic tradition. There are neologisms. There are terms that have never been used. These terms are often employed without any kind of clear definition or without being matched against definitions that came before them. So terms and concepts that...
And we're going to have to go to a quick break. When we come back, I'll let you finish that thought on some of the modern errors that the Catechism responds to. All this and more with Aaron Sang when we get back. Welcome back to Catholic Drive Time. This is your host, Adrian Fonseca. It's so good to be on with you today. Praise be to God. Joining us right now is Aaron Sang. He is the president of Tradovox and the Catholic Catechism Index. I'm actually a subscriber of it, so I receive it every few months when a new one is published. And so I enjoy receiving these old catechisms. It's really a joy to flip through them, and I kind of always like, I wonder how they're going to articulate this answer, and I flip through it and I look through it. It's kind of almost like a little game I play with myself, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. It's a very enjoyable, but we're not talking about that today. Today we're talking about Bishop Athanasius Snyder's new catechism labeled Credo. It is a excellent work. I am actually really blessed to be able to have this, and I want to share with you a personal story about it in a second, but I wanted to let you finish your thought before we went to a break. We were talking about how this catechism is necessary because it responds to some of the modern errors that just weren't questions 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago. So I'll let you finish your thought there, Aaron.
Well, that's about the gist of it there, Adrian. You nailed the nail on the head. It's the articulation of the truths of the faith that do not change within our own contemporary context. So we have things like, for instance, I was speaking to someone recently. We were talking about old catechisms, and we pointed out, none of these old catechisms really specifies that marriage is between a man and a woman. So the positivist, the fellow who says, well, if it's not in a written, clearly articulated and binding formulation, that means it doesn't have any bearing on me. The positivist who looks back across hundreds of years of catechisms and doesn't find this specification, well, marriage is, oh, by the way, it's always only a man and a woman. For the first time in human history, you have this widespread questioning. Well, is that really what marriage is? This natural institution. Well, of course it is. This is one of the things that's just assumed by the entire Catholic tradition. It's in some places, it's alluded to, especially when Genesis, is mentioned, and Adam and Eve as the first instance of the union between man and woman. But for the most part, that's just assumed. And so here you have, this need for a bishop today to very clearly specify, oh, it's a lifelong, it's inexhaustible. It's oh yes, and only between one man and one woman. So this is a good example.
Excellent, excellent. I think that's excellent because we do live in a very weird time, like you said, and previous catechisms are like, oh, it didn't explicitly mention abortion. Oh, it didn't explicitly. Well, some of them kind of did mention abortion a little bit, but some may never mention anything like transgenderism was never mentioned. Technology, using the use of phones and things like that, were not mentioned in old catechisms. And so Bishop Snyder covers a lot of these things that simply were not issues in the past, and former people would never even consider them. I want to share, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Mr. Sang. I was very happy to hear a cousin of mine was never baptized, and I guess it's my dad's aunt. My dad's aunt was never baptized, and then she didn't baptize her daughter, and she didn't baptize her son. And my dad reached out to me a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, and said, hey, I have good news. Your cousin and their family all want to get baptized. And I was like, that's awesome. Praise be to God. And they said, so what do you recommend for them to try to go through RCIA and all that? Because they kind of don't live too close to an area where we have a good RCIA program. And so I contacted a priest friend of mine about a month ago and asked him, hey, can I just give them private catechism lessons and go through Bishop Athanasius Snyder's Credo? And the priest said, yes, go ahead. That's my approval. Just whenever you're done, have them meet with me, and I will give them a thumbs up, making sure that they learn everything they need to learn, and we'll get them baptized. And so I wanted to share that because I think that's an amazing opportunity. And what are your thoughts about using this for like RCA programs and things like that?
Yes, beautiful. That's one of the reasons that the publisher also issued separately a study journal for Credo, is for exactly the kind of applications you're talking about there. The journal itself, it's considerably smaller. It's spiral bound. The idea is you have one kind of page spread, one full page spread per chapter of Credo, and it does exactly the kind of work you're saying, where holding out key terms from the chapter, kind of guided questions for getting deeper into the different doctrinal themes that are raised. Really neat. It pairs excerpts, doctrinal excerpts from the text with excerpts that we pray at Holy Mass. So it's kind of showing this connection, the lex orandi, lex credendi, as the church prays, so she believes. So it's kind of holding that out from chapter to chapter. So yes, that's absolutely what the bishop has in mind with issuing the text. It was something else that was asked of him, His Excellency, in Rome recently when they had the international launch event during the last days of the synod there in Rome, and someone brought that up, kind of how the text could be used. Is this something suitable for RCIA? Is it something suitable for instructing, say, younger folks, high school age, kind of above? Would really be the target audience, I think. And so that was something Bishop mentioned as well. So it would be very helpful for routine instruction like that.
Very good. So you're saying high school age or above. That means People could use it for confirmation prep. They could use it for RCAA. So I think that's an excellent opportunity. So I very much think that this is a good resource that people should check out. I have the book, but I don't have the study journal. So I may have to go and get that from Sophia Institute Press. But now I want to talk about, with the time we have left, there was one particular paragraph, or I guess two, that people really did not like. I saw it pop up on Twitter, and they were like, I was saying, oh, it's endorsed by Scott Hahn. It's endorsed by Bishop Cardinal Sarah. It's endorsed by another bishop that I wasn't familiar with, by contemplative nuns. And I was promoting it on Twitter before I had read it, and someone sent me this paragraph and says, don't you know this paragraph is in there? And I was like, I'm sure there's something there that I just don't get. So here's the paragraph, and I want to get your response, Mr. Sang. Paragraphs 224 and 225 state, is the dignity of the human person rooted in his creation in God's image and likeness? He responds, this was true for Adam, but with original sin, the human person lost this resemblance and dignity in the eyes of God. He recovers this dignity through baptism and keeps it as long as he does not sin mortally. 225 says, then human dignity is not the same in all persons? No, the human person loses his dignity in proportion to his free choice of error or evil. For example, the dignity of Adolf Hitler and St. Francis of Assisi are not the same. Mr. Sang, people are saying that Bishop Snyder is denying the Imago Dei. So what is the right way to look at this passage?
Sure, it's a great question. Someone had mentioned that to me too, that there was blowback about that. So I'm glad you brought it up. The first thing is to point out that the image of God and likeness are classically considered as different categories. So one thinks of Aquinas, of course, in the Summa. And the important part about this text itself is that the term itself, or the phrase, really, human dignity, this is a phrase that does not have a definitive theological content. So it's used in a multivalent way, and has been since the Church Fathers. I mean, you find this consideration, the image and likeness of God, is kind of one thing, the interpretation, the exegesis of that text from Genesis, but then also kind of the corollary, or at least what we think of as a corollary today, which is the human dignity, this idea of human dignity. So first, I mean, the notion that the bishop is some way denying that persons have some innate moral value is of course laughable. I mean, anyone who would assert that obviously hasn't read the book. The whole section on, for instance, the fifth commandment, where the bishop, let me just find that actually, because let's see. So this is the second part. So there are three parts the Catechism's divided into, which is kind of the classical distinction of the parts of a given catechism, kind of faith, morals, and the means of grace. And so this is part two, the morals. We're talking about fifth commandment. This is question 504. This is in the section dealing with offenses against human life, right? So where, the bishop, again, he cites the use of human embryos or fetuses as an object of experimentation constitutes a crime against their dignity as human beings who have a right to the same respect owed to the child that is once born, just as to every person. Okay, so I mean, and it goes on. I'm not going to read more from there, but this notion that perhaps the bishop is somehow undermining the value, the innate kind of moral value of any personal life. Well, that's laughable in the extreme. You have to read the rest of the text, which is something else that he points out early in the book, is that there's for every issue there's various lenses of treating it. And that's why there's such a huge index for the book, is so that you can find, how, for instance, human dignity is treated doctrinally in a section on faith, how it's treated morally, its applications in the moral life. That would be part two. So I would encourage anybody who's confused on it, use the index, use the topical index on human dignity. But the other point theologically that he's trying to make is really to combat an error that has crept in, especially since kind of the latter half of the 20th century, which is this equating of human existence as such with a moral spiritual value in the eyes of God. This is really a concept from the Enlightenment period, which is basically trying to say, because we exist, we are all children of God. Well, this idea is a grave departure from not only the whole kind of catechetical tradition of the church, but the Gospels themselves, the teaching of our Lord, who is good but God alone. How do we obtain this kind of moral, spiritual goodness in the eyes of God? Well, it's only through grace. Grace alone confers that on us since the fall, which again, as you mentioned from Bishop's quotation, is what he's pointing out, is that this was true of Adam. You have this inherent image and likeness to God by way of grace, but by way of his creation, Adam's creation. But that's no longer the case for any human being. And this is something that any Catholic should recognize, because we sing it every year at Easter, right? This is part of the Exultet. When we chant, out loud verbally, what good, our birth would have been no gain had we not been redeemed. That we sing that solemnly every year. That's why, right? So our mere human existence as such would be no gain had we not been redeemed, if we did not, in fact, take hold of the redemption that's been granted to us by way of this infused grace in our souls. That alone is the way that we obtain the fullness, we'd say, of human dignity, this participation in the life of God, that sense of moral goodness. And that's what the bishop is pointing out, which is, of course, why he uses the comparison between St. Francis and Hitler, right? So of course, are we talking about an equality there in the eyes of God? Absolutely not. Someone who we know is transfigured by grace, as opposed to someone who's committed these grave crimes.
And that's all the time we have left. Thank you very much, Mr. Sang. Check them out, traddyfox.com. But go get Credo from Sophia Institute Press. We'll be right back with more right after this.